Rain fell like penance. The fire didn't ask permission. It just bloomed, red and alive, across the wet field where metal drums waited to burn. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger stood silent, his coat soaked through, his men cheering faintly somewhere behind him. 50,000 gallons of American fuel, captured in one night. Enough to turn engines, dreams, maybe even a lost war. Yet the colonel only saw reflection, his pale face rippling in puddles of oil. The fuel shimmered like a mirror, too honest to look into. Beside him, Lieutenant Hans Weber rubbed his trembling hands together, whispering about miracles, about hope. Sergeant Otto Klein just stared at the barrels, each one marked with a white star, each one heavier than truth. The wind smelled of gasoline and dying rain. Somewhere a tank coughed, refusing to start. Somewhere else a soldier laughed without meaning to. And in the center of it all, Kruger thought, what if victory had already burned itself out, and all that was left was the smoke pretending to be light? The morning after the storm smelled like gasoline and surrender. Kruger walked the line of captured barrels, boots sinking into the mud. His men still grinned, still called it a miracle. But the colonel heard only the hollow echo of drums, not of war, but of empty faith. The labels read, U.S. Army Fuel, 1944. Clean, perfect letters. The enemy's abundance was almost obscene. Hans followed, quiet now, his optimism drowned by the math in his head. 50,000 gallons, enough to move, but not enough to matter. Otto muttered that even the engines would weep for mercy before the week ended. Kruger stopped, pressing his glove against one cold drum. He could feel it vibrating faintly, as if the fuel itself was alive, waiting to burn, waiting to choose which side deserved it. Later that afternoon, Kruger gathered his officers inside a broken command tent. The air smelled of wet maps and damp tobacco. He spoke of strategy, of rationing, of engines that could breathe again, but his words sounded like ghosts reciting orders from another war. Hans watched him, jaw tight, while Otto fumbled with his lighter, pretending to listen. Outside, trucks rumbled like tired lungs. When Kruger's voice finally broke, silence filled the tent thicker than smoke. He looked at the faces of his men, too young, too loyal, and felt the unbearable weight of being the only one who had already seen the end. Evening crept in with a strange calm. The rain had stopped, but the air still wept. Kruger walked alone past the fuel drums again, listening to their metal hush. He thought of every road that fuel could take them, and every one that led straight to hell. In the distance, a radio crackled with news of Allied advances. The words hit like invisible bullets. Kruger turned away, gripping his coat tight. Behind him, a single drum began to leak, gasoline trickling into the dirt, like a slow confession. Night fell like surrender. The campfire burned low, its smoke curling into the endless dark. Kruger sat beside it, helmet off, hands still trembling from nothing he could name. Hans sat across from him, saying nothing, eyes fixed on the flames. Otto slept near the tanks, his snores mingling with distant thunder. The colonel whispered to no one. To God, perhaps, or to the fire itself. We took their fuel, Hans. But maybe they already took our reason to fight. The wind didn't answer, but it carried the smell of gasoline one last time. By morning, the storm had cleared, but the sky looked ashamed. The world smelled of rust and fuel. Too clean, too quiet. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger stood by the captured barrels, reading every label like scripture written by an enemy who believed in forever. United States Army, premium grade. The words mocked him softly. Lieutenant Hans Weber approached with a clipboard full of numbers, gallons, weight, calculations that meant nothing against time. Sergeant Otto Klein muttered that the Americans treated fuel like water. Kruger didn't reply. He watched the sunlight strike the white stars on each drum and thought of how much power it took to print hope onto metal. He realized then that they hadn't captured fuel. They had captured proof of an empire that could afford to lose this much and still win. The depot buzzed with forced energy. Soldiers shouted, engines coughed. Hope tried to sound like movement. Kruger oversaw the loading of trucks, but his gaze drifted to the horizon, to smoke plumes that rose where friendly towns used to stand. Hans walked beside him, reciting numbers about how far the fuel could take them. "Enough for one push," he said. Kruger nodded without hearing. The colonel thought of how the Americans could lose thousands of gallons and still keep advancing, while he was counting every drop like a prayer. He turned to Hans. "You ever think," he said softly, "that the enemy doesn't just have more fuel? They have more future?" In the mess tent, rain pattered faintly against canvas as Kruger ate in silence. The food was cold, the conversation colder. A young corporal spoke of turning the captured fuel into victory, maybe even pushing the Allies back. The others laughed nervously, clinging to the fantasy. Kruger stared at his tin cup, the coffee reflecting his eyes like dark water. "Victory?" he murmured. "Fuel doesn't win wars. Men do, and ours are running on smoke." The tent fell quiet. Outside, thunder groaned far away, like the world agreeing. Late that night, Kruger couldn't sleep. He walked alone through the depot where moonlight painted the barrels silver. Each drum hummed faintly with the breath of potential. Power waiting for purpose. He placed his hand on one, feeling the cool metal under his glove. In that quiet, he thought of factories across the ocean, of ships crossing freely, of men who would never have to scrape mud from their dreams. He realized what true defeat was. Not dying, not surrendering, but knowing that even when you win, you've already been outlived. Before dawn, Kruger stood at the edge of camp, watching the trucks depart. Engines growled, headlights cut through the mist, and men waved as if heading towards something noble. Hans joined him quietly, coat buttoned to the throat. "We could make a difference," Hans whispered. Kruger didn't look away from the departing convoy. "Yes," he said, voice barely above the wind, "but not to the war, only to ourselves." The trucks disappeared into the gray, leaving only the scent of fuel, sharp, cold, and endless. Engines roared again that morning, coughing life into metal carcasses that had waited too long. The camp came alive with the illusion of strength. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger walked through it like a ghost, pretending to be commander. The smell of gasoline coated the air. The ground trembled with forced hope. Men cheered as tanks moved, but Kruger's eyes saw ghosts in every exhaust cloud. "See, Colonel?" Lieutenant Hans Weber shouted over the din. "We're back on our feet." Kruger nodded, his mouth saying yes while his heart whispered no. Sergeant Otto Klein cursed at a jammed piston, laughing at his own futility. Every drop of captured fuel burned like denial itself, bright, loud, and doomed to run out. Later, inside the operations tent, Kruger leaned over a map dotted with impossible arrows. "We push east by dawn," he said, voice steady as stone. Hans frowned. "The roads are gone." "The bridges, too?" Kruger didn't look up. "Then we build new ones." He knew it was madness, but he needed the sound of orders to drown out the silence. Otto stood at the entrance, shaking his head, but saying nothing. Hope had become command's last weapon, and Kruger, its most willing victim. The convoy rolled out under heavy clouds. Mud clung to every tire. Rain returned in a whisper. Kruger rode in the lead truck, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to see the truth reflected in his men's faces. Each kilometer chewed through fuel and faith alike. "We'll reach the bridge before nightfall," Hans said from the passenger seat, trying to sound certain. "If the bridge is still there," Kruger murmured. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Behind them, Otto's truck belched smoke, black, angry, final. By dusk, the convoy stopped at what used to be a bridge, now a skeleton of twisted metal over a dark river. The soldiers fell silent, The rain hissed as if laughing. Kruger stepped out, mud sucking at his boots. "We'll find another way," he said automatically. Hans looked at him, expression hollow. "There is no other way, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. He couldn't admit it, not yet. Behind them, Otto kicked at a fuel drum. "We've got enough to turn back," he muttered. "Or burn here." Kruger stared into the river's reflection, seeing his face ripple with every drop of rain. He realized that leadership at its end was just another word for pretending. Night came heavy. The men built fires under tarps, the fuel drums looming like silent witnesses. Kruger sat apart, cleaning his pistol, not because it needed cleaning, but because he needed control over something. Hans joined him quietly, staring at the flames. "Sir," he said, "if we go forward, we run dry before the next line." Kruger didn't look up. "If we turn back, we run dry anyway." Otto approached, tired eyes flickering with reflection. "Then what do we fight for?" he asked. Kruger paused, the fire crackling between them. "For the illusion," he said, "until it stops fighting back." The first explosion wasn't from battle. It was from within. A truck, overloaded with fuel, caught a spark from a careless hand. The blast tore through the rain, lighting the night like a false sunrise. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger ran toward the fire, shouting orders that disappeared into the roar. Men scrambled, some to fight the flames, some to flee from them. Lieutenant Hans Weber dragged a wounded soldier through the mud, while Sergeant Otto Klein tried to smother burning cloth with his coat. The air was alive with screams, fire, and rain arguing in the same breath. Kruger stared at the inferno, the barrels bursting one by one, each detonation a heartbeat of truth. The fire didn't care about sides or uniforms. It burned everything equal. When the fire died, it left silence too heavy to carry. The ground steamed, the sky turned black again, and the air reeked of melted steel. Kruger stood over what remained of the depot, half the fuel gone, the rest poisoned by debris. Hans approached, face gray with ash. "We lost it, sir," he said. Kruger's voice came slow, steady. "No, it was never ours." Otto kicked a charred drum. "All on fuel," he muttered, "and we couldn't even use it." Kruger looked at the flames dying in puddles. "It used us," he whispered. "It showed us what winning really costs." Morning came gray and cold. Kruger sat alone beside the ruins, writing in his field journal, words that no one would ever read. He wrote about silence, about mirrors made of gasoline, about men who mistook burning for progress. Hans watched from a distance, unable to approach. Otto loaded the remaining drums, muttering under his breath, "Well, move what's left." Kruger closed the notebook and looked at the horizon where smoke met sky. "No," he said softly to himself. "We'll move until there's nothing left to move." By afternoon, the remaining fuel was divided, half for retreat, half for fire. Kruger gave the order without ceremony. "Burn the rest," he said. Hans looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, that's enough to move half the division." Kruger met his gaze, tired, unshaken. "And where will they go?" No one answered. Otto struck a match, hesitated, then let it fall. The flames caught fast, consuming the last clean barrels. The soldiers watched, faces lit by orange and resignation. For the first time, Kruger didn't look away. The truth burned quietly. That destruction was the only order still obeyed. That night, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The stars returned, faint and indifferent. Kruger stood alone where the depot had been, the ground still warm beneath his boots. The fire had gone out, but its echo lingered in the wind. Hans approached, slower this time. "You did what had to be done," he said. Kruger turned, the ghost of a smile fading before it could live. "I did what was left to do." Otto joined them, carrying a dented canister. The last gallon, shimmering like a lie. Kruger looked at it, then at the horizon. "Keep it," he said. "Someday we'll need to remember what this felt like." Dawn crawled over the ruins like it was afraid to touch them. The air hung heavy with the smell of burnt fuel and regret. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger stood before his men, who waited for orders that no longer made sense. Faces blackened with soot, eyes searching for meaning. None found any. "We move east," Kruger said flatly, though he didn't believe it. Lieutenant Hans Weber clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Sergeant Otto Klein tightened a strap on a half-empty fuel canister and muttered, "East or nowhere, it's the same." Kruger's gaze swept over them, men still pretending to fight a war that had already decided their fate. He turned away so they wouldn't see the doubt living behind his eyes. The convoy moved again, but slower this time, engines coughing like old men refusing to die. Every mile felt like denial stretched thin. Hans sat beside Kruger in the lead vehicle, staring at the road that refused to end. "Sir," he began, voice uncertain, "we've lost 3 trucks already." Kruger didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where fog blurred friend and foe into the same gray. "We keep going," he said finally. "As long as there's fuel, there's movement." Hans looked at him, not with respect anymore, but with sorrow. "And when there isn't?" Kruger didn't reply. The engine answered for him, sputtering like a dying breath. By midday, the engines died. One by one, they coughed, groaned, and fell silent. Men climbed down without orders, staring into the empty fuel tanks like graves. Kruger stepped out, listening to the silence, swallowing everything. Hans approached him, voice trembling. "We're finished. There's nothing left to burn." Kruger's reply came quiet, cracked. "There's always something left." Otto, standing near the rear truck, threw his helmet into the mud. "You're wrong," he shouted. "There's nothing left but pride, and pride doesn't move tanks." His voice echoed, bitter and true. Kruger didn't look back. He just whispered, "Then let it carry us the rest of the way." That night, the argument finally broke the silence. Inside a dim tent, Hans faced Kruger across a flickering lantern. "We keep following orders," Hans said, voice shaking. "But no one's listening anymore. Not even you." Kruger's shadow loomed over the map, trembling with the flame. "My duty isn't to believe, Lieutenant. It's to continue." Hans stepped forward. "Continue into what? Into nothing?" Outside, Otto listened, cigarette burning down between his fingers. Kruger's reply came low. "Raw. If we stop, we admit it's over, and I can't yet." Hans looked at him with pity, the kind that feels worse than anger. "Then we're not soldiers anymore, sir. We're just men trying not to fall apart." Morning came without color. The soldiers waited for orders that didn't come. Hans sat beside the trucks, head bowed. Otto loaded his rifle out of habit, though there was nothing left to aim at. Kruger stood alone, watching the empty road ahead. The last of the fuel was gone, the barrels now just hollow echoes. He took off his gloves, feeling the cold bite his skin. "Well, I'll rest here," he said quietly. Hans looked up, and then Kruger didn't answer. He just watched the horizon, where the fog had started to clear, revealing not a destination, but the certainty of ending. The colonel understood at last. It wasn't the fuel that had run out. It was belief. The sky that morning looked like iron. Frozen, dull, unbreakable. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger walked the line of abandoned trucks, each one a monument to exhaustion. His men huddled by small fires, whispering about surrender, about survival. No one mentioned victory anymore. Lieutenant Hans Weber followed, notebook forgotten in his pocket. "Sir," he said quietly, "we have 1 drum left, maybe enough for 20 kilometers." Kruger stopped. "Then 20 is all the war deserves." His voice was soft but final. Sergeant Otto Klein approached, eyes hollow. Orders from command. Kruger looked past him toward the lifeless horizon. Command's been silent for 3 days. He paused. Maybe silence is the only order left worth following. Later that day, they reached an abandoned village. Houses gutted, windows like open wounds. The men scavenged quietly, trading bullets for bread, fear for memory. Kruger entered a ruined church. The roof was half gone, the altar black with soot. He sat in a pew, helmet beside him, hands clasped not in prayer, but in habit. The silence there felt holy, or maybe it was just empty. Hans stood by the door, hesitant to enter. "You still believe, sir?" Kruger looked up at the cross, its wood cracked and splintered. "Belief isn't what keeps men alive," he said. "It's what kills them slower." That evening, snow began to fall. Soft, soundless, merciful. The men gathered around a single fire, wrapped in torn blankets. Otto poured the last drops of fuel into the flames, making them flare briefly before fading. "That's it," he said. "No more miracles." Kruger watched the fire die, its glow reflecting in his eyes like a closing memory. Hans whispered, "Maybe it's better this way." Kruger turned toward him, face unreadable. "Better is for those who win," he said. "We settle for what's left." The wind carried the last smoke into the night, taking their words with it. At midnight, a messenger arrived, alone, pale, trembling. He carried a crumpled order sealed in mud. "Retreat immediately. Destroy remaining supplies." Kruger read it twice, then handed it to Hans without a word. Otto laughed dryly. "Destroy what? Our breath?" Kruger stood, the paper shaking in his hand. "They're telling us to erase ourselves," he said. The firelight flickered across his face as he tore the message in half. "We'll burn what's left, and then we'll walk home." Hans met his eyes. "Home doesn't exist anymore." Kruger nodded. "Then we'll walk toward wherever it should have been." By dawn, the last fire was out. The camp lay silent, blanketed in snow. Kruger stood with his men one final time. "We leave the trucks," he said. "We walk." No one argued. Hans looked at the wrecked vehicles, monuments to what was once possible. Otto slung his rifle over his shoulder, breath visible in the cold air. As they began to move, Kruger turned for one last look at the field behind them. Engines frozen, barrels empty, ghosts of movement still whispering in the frost. He thought of how the war had promised immortality and delivered only echoes. "Forward," he said quietly, though there was nowhere left to go. Years later, the war was over, but its smell never left him. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger sat at a small cafe in a quiet German town, his uniform traded for an old gray coat. The world around him had healed. New roads, new cars, the hum of peace. Yet every time he heard an engine start, his chest tightened like a wound remembering itself. He stirred his coffee slowly, the dark surface trembling as a truck rumbled by outside. The sound of fuel burning still spoke to him, a language of ghosts. Across the street, a boy waved a small American flag, laughing. Kruger smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from understanding too much. He lived quietly, teaching mechanics at a small trade school. His hands still remembered engines like they remembered prayers. Hans Weber visited sometimes, older now, slower, with a limp and a family waiting back home. They didn't speak much of the war. Words had nothing new to say. One afternoon, as they repaired an old motorcycle, Hans said softly, "Funny, isn't it? We used to fight over fuel, and now we fix machines that barely need it." Kruger chuckled, tightening a bolt. Maybe the world just learned to run on guilt instead. Their laughter faded into a silence that felt lighter than sorrow, yet heavier than peace. Otto Klein never returned. Rumor said he died on the road home, Others claimed he just kept walking until there was nothing left to follow. Kruger sometimes saw his face in strangers, mechanics, truck drivers, men who still smelled faintly of diesel. On rainy nights, Kruger would sit by his window, listening to the rain hitting the glass. The sound reminded him of that first night. The captured fuel, the fire, the question that never stopped burning. He whispered to the dark, who burned first? The man holding the fire, or the one it touched? The rain never answered, but it never stopped trying. One morning, Kruger stopped by a gas station on his way to work. The smell of petrol hit him like a memory, resurrected. Rows of clean, modern pumps gleamed under the sun. Efficient, endless, innocent. A young attendant filled his tank, humming to himself. Kruger watched the clear fuel flow through the hose, catching the light. He realized, with quiet awe, that the world had learned to turn war's ghost into progress. But part of him still felt the echo, that every engine running today was built on the breath of something that once burned too bright. That night, Kruger walked home beneath a sky full of stars, the same ones that had watched him burn a world down. He paused at the bridge outside town, rebuilt now, strong and silent. The river below whispered like it always had. He closed his eyes, hearing engines that no longer existed, smelling fire that had long gone cold. "We captured 50,000 gallons," he murmured to the dark. But it was never the fuel that mattered. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of oil, rain, and peace. For the first time, he didn't turn away. He just stood there. One man, one echo, and a silence that finally felt earned.